Captain Midnight.
This video is brought to you by Skillshare. In 2013, while on a press tour for his movie Lincoln, Steven Spielberg gave a fairly grim prediction while speaking at an event at USC, saying, "There's eventually going to be an implosion or a big meltdown. There's going to be an implosion where 3 or 4 or maybe even a half dozen mega-budget movies are going to go crashing into the ground, and that's going to change the paradigm." Now, the director walked back that statement a bit a couple years later, saying he wasn't predicting the whole industry would collapse. But I think this year, 2023, has kind of borne out his main point. Movies like The Flash and Shazam! Fury of the Gods are crashing and burning at the box office at an almost unprecedented scale relative to their budgets, with plenty of movies like Dial of Destiny, Ant-Man 3, and Little Mermaid really underperforming as well. And couple that with the writers and actors striking simultaneously for the first time since 1960. All of that feels worth examining to me. How things got here, why the writers and actors unions are striking, and probably most presumptuous of all, considering I'm just some guy on YouTube, my thoughts on what the future could look like going forward. So I feel a little bad picking on it 2 videos in a row here, but Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny is a great example of what's wrong with the film industry right now. Creatively, sure, I talked about that already, but economically too. This is a movie that cost $300 million. $300 million. That's more than most Fast and Furious movies and roughly 3 John Wick Chapter 4s. Kingdom of the Crystal Skull made money, and of course films like Raiders and The Last Crusade were huge in their day. And to be fair, I'm sure COVID protocols and all the stuff that goes with that really added to Dial's budget quite a bit. But it just seems a little nuts to me to bet that big on an action movie that stars an 80-year-old, especially when the character already came back for an underwhelming legacy sequel type movie. You know, there was some appetite for a new Indiana Jones film. With a reasonable budget, its box office gross would be pretty respectable. But expecting it to make anywhere near like Force Awakens money just seems doomed from the start. And I know this is a cliche, but the largest studios have just been increasingly putting their eggs in a few very expensive baskets. You look at Warner's release schedule this year, and it's almost all superhero movies, sequels like The Nun 2 and Meg 2, big IP movies like Barbie and Wonka, and even the lower budget stuff is remakes and sequels like House Party or Magic Mike: The Last Dance. Taken as a whole, it is an incredibly risk-averse lineup of movies, relying on the tried and true and not sticking its neck out for a single, truly original, non-IP vision. That's kind of ironic now that it features some of the biggest money losers in studio history. This stands in stark contrast with the list of movies that WB released in like 1995. And really, this is not me just trying to say that movies were better back then or something. Like 2 of their biggest releases, Batman Forever and Ace Ventura: When Nature Calls, are both sequels that I'm not crazy about. It's more about all the different types of movies that they used to release theatrically back then. One of their highest grossing films of the year was Bridges of Madison County, an Eastwood Street romantic drama aimed squarely at the over 40 crowd. I mean, looking at all the major studio releases, you'll find a lot of comedies, rom-coms, dramas, and thrillers. Lots of the kind of mid-budget movies that aren't made for a theatrical audience very much anymore. A movie like the recent No Hard Feelings, starring Jennifer Lawrence, would not have felt notable at all 30, 20, or even 10 years ago. And now it feels like one of the mid-budget R-rated comedies' last attempts to hang on and survive. Abandoning so many genres for just the big tentpole films has left what used to be theatrical audiences, especially those older audiences, without much of a reason to go to the theater anymore. Now, it's already hard in a post-2020 movie landscape to convince people to go to a theater, but by not even trying to serve the crowds that used to go to these movies, they've narrowed their audiences even more. And if you're thinking, well, I don't really care about legal thrillers or rom-coms, I'm glad the focus is more on big-budget superhero movies. I get it, but I honestly think this current system is hurting that stuff too. The MCU, by trying to appeal to the broadest possible audience, which it has to because these movies are so expensive, consistently feels like it's playing it safe. If some of these had tighter budgets and they weren't all make or break centerpieces of Disney's lineup, they'd probably be a lot more unique and free to try new things that go outside the MCU formula. And I know some of you may really hate the idea of a reduced budget, but like, Ant-Man 3 cost a lot more than Dune and looked much worse. Like, are these massive budgets even helping making these movies better? Or is it just making them terrified to try anything new? So yeah, I think the major studios have tripled down on the biggest, most expensive moneymakers at the expense of nearly everything else, and are finding out that that's not working out like it used to. Lots of people haven't gone to a theater since 2019, but if you're an older moviegoer who doesn't care about superheroes or horror, there probably hasn't been a lot to entice you to go either, especially in terms of movies that have a real marketing budget behind them. Like, I'm really glad there's still distributors releasing lower budget films like A24 and Neon, but those mid-budget, widely accessible dramas and comedies disappearing from theaters, I think that's been a disaster for the film industry. And I say this as someone who loves both superheroes and horror movies. But it's not like those types of stories disappeared altogether, right? Like legal thrillers, rom-coms, and the like. They still exist, they're just more likely to be a streaming show or miniseries now. So what's the problem? Well, this won't come as a shock for people who have watched my videos on Netflix and Disney+, but I think the streamers have left the industry on far more shaky ground than anyone could have predicted back when Netflix Instant took off. I'll get to the bigger picture in a minute, but when talking about the streamers and the strikes, I think it's worth zooming in a bit and talking about how television production has changed. To illustrate, let's make up two hypothetical successful shows from different eras and compare what it would be like to be a young writer for each of them in very broad strokes. One is a 2000s network show, think CBS's How I Met Your Mother or Fox's 24, versus a recent streaming show, something like Hulu's The Bear or Netflix's Wednesday. On a 20+ episode network show, you're working between 20 and 40 weeks. And you're present in an in-person writer's room, ideally learning from more experienced writers and producers. It's likely you get a chance to go to the set when your episode is being shot, and learn a lot more about production from the director, cast, and crew. Maybe even sitting in on the episode's edit as well. Basically, just soaking up different aspects of TV production. And if all goes well, returning next season with more responsibility. Maybe a new title, like graduating from staff writer to story editor. Not only did this provide you with stable income for a decent length of time, but it also taught you so much about production, essentially training the next generation of showrunners as writers work their way up the ladder. You also got residuals from reruns, so every time an episode you wrote shows up on Comedy Central or whatever, you'd get a check. TV has never been perfect, but this model was a sustainable way for writers to create television, where they both learned on the job and were able to make money long after they had retired, thanks to people still watching their work. Then you look at a current streaming show, where writers have talked about working in online Zoom-only mini-rooms for much shorter 6 to 10 weeks. There's a very good chance you're never going to set or meeting the crew during production, and even if you're on a successful show, it will probably only run a few seasons, with sometimes years between active production. Plus, basically every big streamer refuses to share concrete numbers with its workers, so you don't really get residuals based on how well it's performing. You could conceivably write for a show as huge as Wednesday, but its success doesn't really do much for you on the back end. Sure, being associated with a hugely successful show is nice, but financially, it may not even be all that different from writing for a Netflix show that gets canned after a single season. You're getting less production experience and getting paid less. And TV actors are seeing their livelihoods cut down in a pretty similar way. I remember reading Josh Peck's memoir a while ago and being kind of shocked that Nickelodeon actors don't receive residuals. I mean, anyone that watched Teen Nick back in the day knows just how much they reran Drake and Josh. He didn't see any of that money beyond what he got paid for initially filming it. That was a notably bad deal back then, and now it's looking a little bit more like the norm. Residuals on streaming shows are complex and vary from streamer to streamer. But one thing almost everyone can agree on is this: they're a lot less. This may not be a huge deal to really established stars who can ask for more money up front to make up for that, but that's far from everyone. Sydney Sweeney even said that she basically received no residuals for Euphoria on Max. Now, I know these are famous and well-established actors that I'm talking about here, but one thing that's important to keep in mind is that most SAG actors striking right now are not rich or famous at all, and often go months and months between jobs, a time when those residual checks were really vital. Now, there's a lot of things in these negotiations, like AI, that I haven't even touched on here, but I hope that I've at least gotten across some of the broad reasoning behind these strikes. CEOs like Disney's Bob Iger and Warner Discovery's David Zaslav will of course say that now is no time for a strike, and that writers and actors are not being realistic about their demands. The thing is though, it was the executives, not the WGA or SAG, that decided to treat their incredibly profitable century-old businesses like 2010's tech companies to chase that short-term Wall Street high. Sure, no one could have seen COVID coming, but it wasn't COVID that made Disney dump millions of dollars into Marvel streaming shows that make less and less of an impact, and that now even Bob Iger says were a mistake. Executives from NBC Universal to Warner to Disney and more made the choice to go all in on their streaming services, and for a while, it seemed like it was working. Many of them were being evaluated like the 2010s tech companies that investors couldn't get enough of, even though that's not what they were, with the massive losses ignored because that stock price was always going up. But now, years into the streaming revolution, they're no longer the slick, promising future. They're mostly just second-tier streaming services that have never turned a profit. In deciding that their companies could all be like Netflix, studio executives let the Netflix model steer them off a cliff. So where does Hollywood go from here? Well, I'm not going to pretend to have the answer, but I will say that it might be pretty notable that the last time this happened was in the 60s. The 60s were a really rough time for Hollywood. High-profile flops were everywhere, with movies like Dr. Dolittle, Hello Dolly, and Cleopatra being extremely expensive and failing to break even. So many of the biggest genres of the time, westerns, war pictures, and family musicals, suddenly seemed to stop connecting with audiences, who began to greet many of these movies with a tepid shrug. The moguls of the old Hollywood system were dying off, or selling their studios. You probably know what happened next. Movies like Bonnie and Clyde, The Graduate, and Easy Rider helped usher in what was eventually dubbed New Hollywood, a youthful burst of creative energy that gave us directors like Martin Scorsese, Brian De Palma, Francis Ford Coppola, and of course, Lucas and Spielberg. Now, it would be goofy of me to say that this is just likely how it's going to play out now, but I do hope some new creative rejuvenation comes out of this, eventually. That the cracks that are now showing so clearly in this Hollywood system allow for some really creative people to sneak in and shake things up, to take risks on projects that we didn't see coming. And those often come in the form of mid-budget movies that aren't connected to an IP, something studios rarely give young directors these days. Don't get me wrong, there's still great movies and TV coming out, like of course there are. But 2023 really feels like a transition year for Hollywood, and I hope it eventually turns out to be one for the better. As much as I talk about huge Hollywood movies and shows on this channel, something I always have a ton of respect for is the DIY, low-budget passion projects, whatever form they might take. If you're interested in making something on YouTube, one thing I always recommend is Marques Brownlee's YouTube Success, Script, Shoot, and Edit on Skillshare, because Brownlee is really the perfect YouTube mentor. I go back to this one often just because it's so well done and so concise. And it pairs extremely well with Creative Breakthrough, 8 exercises to power your creativity, confidence, and career. A great class that helps you harness your creativity. Everyone has a different goal in mind when they join Skillshare, and none of them are too small. Whether you want to take a class on improving your productivity, tackle imposter syndrome, or learn how to code in Python, Skillshare is going to have your back. So go to the link in the description or pinned comment below, and the first 1,000 people to use the link will get 1 month free trial of Skillshare.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once, because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started, because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.